People in desperation called the office. When can we get the check? We desperately need it. And I suspect it was the same thing in Texas and the same thing in every other state in this country. People are hurting. We cannot go home unless we address the needs of those people. And the amendment that Senator Hawley and I are introducing could not be simpler. It is $1,200 in direct payment for adults up to a certain limit, the same limit as was in the CARES Act, and $500 for their children. We have already voted and passed that exact same provision in March. And the situation today is not better. In some respects, it is worse. So I would hope that we would have bipartisan support for this legislation. Look, it is no great secret, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or whatever, that people are losing faith in their government. I applaud the very hard work that each of the negotiators are doing, Democrats and Republicans. But the truth of the matter is that the results up to this point of those negotiations are totally unsatisfactory, given the economic desperation facing tens of millions of working families all across this country. As I think everyone will remember, back in March of this year, at the beginning of the pandemic, the United States Congress acted unanimously, Democrats and Republicans worked with President Trump to come up with an economic package that went a long way toward preventing absolute misery and destitution for many of our people. Through no fault of their own, COVID-19 resulted in millions of our people losing their jobs and their income. That's what the pandemic did. Nobody is to blame. That's what happened. And in response, in March, Democrats and Republicans in the Congress came together, worked with the President of the United States, and in a very significant way responded to that crisis. That is what we did in March. Madam President, what I don't understand is that at a time when in many ways the economic and public health crisis is worse today than it was in March, I don't understand why we are not responding accordingly. In March, as you know, we passed the $2.2 trillion CARES Act, which included a $600 supplement to unemployed workers. And my God, what relief that was to millions of workers who had lost their jobs. And in addition, we provided a $1,200 direct payment for every working class adult in this country, plus $500 for their kids. Once again, and let me repeat this, once again, we did this unanimously, and we did it working with President Trump despite many of the enormous disagreements that a lot of us have with President Trump on so many issues. Now, what I don't understand is if we could work together in March, if we could have succeeded 9 months ago, why can we not do exactly the same thing right now? And that is why I will insist that any agreement in terms of a COVID-19 relief package must include not only strong unemployment benefits, but a $1,200 direct payment for the working families of this country, similarly structured to what was included in the CARES package of March. And I will be introducing an amendment to the one-week continuing resolution to make sure that that occurs, that every working-class adult in this country receives another $1,200 direct payment plus $500 for their kids. If we could do it in March, and it was the right thing then, now, at a time when the situation in many ways is even worse, we can and must do it today. Madam President, every member of this body, I know, wants to get out of Washington to get home to their families for the holiday season, and put me at the very top of that list. But at a time when so many American families are suffering, when so many people don't know how they're going to feed their kids or prevent being evicted from their homes, or how they're going to pay for a doctor's visit, we cannot leave Washington and return to our families unless we address the economic suffering that so many other families are facing. When a national emergency occurs, the United States government must respond. And we are in a national emergency today. To get out of Washington, to turn our backs on the suffering of so many men, women, and children in Vermont and in every other state in this country would be immoral, it would be unconscionable, and we cannot allow that to happen. Again, we must make certain that every working family in this country receives a $1,200 direct payment plus $500 for their kids. That is the least that we can do. Madam President, let me be as clear as I can be. Today, as a result of the horrific pandemic and economic meltdown, the American working class is hurting in a way that has not been experienced since the Great Depression of the 1930s. In terms of public health, yesterday alone, over 220,000 Americans were diagnosed with COVID-19, yesterday. And tragically, over 3,000 died from this horrific virus. We are experiencing now some of the worst days in terms of cases being diagnosed, in terms of hospitalization, in terms of death. That is where we are today. In other words, more Americans were killed by the coronavirus yesterday than were killed on 9/11. Madam President, tens of millions of our fellow citizens have lost their jobs as a result of the pandemic. They have lost their incomes. They have lost their health insurance. They have depleted their life savings. And let me tell you this, we deferred evictions. We prevented people from becoming evicted from their homes. But when at some point that deferment ends, all across this country, people are going to be owing thousands and thousands of dollars to their landlords. They don't have the money to pay that. And tens of millions of people are in danger of being evicted. Madam President, you may have noticed that there were reports out there that hunger, this is the United States of America, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, We're looking at numbers which suggest that hunger is at the highest level that we have seen in decades. Children in America are going hungry. And all across this country, tenants are worried that they're going to get a knock on the door from the sheriff, evicting them from their homes or their apartments and throwing their belongings out on the street to join the other 500,000 Americans who are now homeless. But what is being discussed and negotiated right now with Democratic and Republican senators only allocates $348 billion in new money. The remaining $560 billion are funds transferred from the CARES Act that have not yet been obligated. So what we're talking about now, as opposed to $3.4 trillion passed in the HEROES Act, is roughly speaking $348 billion in new money right now. We're talking about, roughly speaking, 10% of the working families of this country who are facing extreme economic desperation. If we could act effectively in March through the CARES Act, we can act effectively today as we enter this holiday season. Once again, I very much appreciate the hard work that has gone into the current $908 billion proposal being worked on by a number of Democratic and Republican senators. But simply stated, given the horrific extent of the current crisis and the desperation of so many of our people, this proposal does not go anywhere far enough. In truth, rather than the $3.4 trillion, which we on the Democratic side called for in the HEROES Act and passed in the House, the U.S. House of Representatives a number of months ago passed a $3.4 trillion bill. But what is being discussed and negotiated right now with Democratic and Republican senators only allocates $348 billion in new money. The remaining $560 billion are funds transferred from the CARES Act that have not yet been obligated. So what we're talking about now, as opposed to $3.4 trillion passed in the HEROES Act, is roughly speaking $348 billion in new money right now. We're talking about, roughly speaking, 10% of new money compared to what was passed in the House. That is absurd. That is unacceptable. I am prepared to negotiate, but I cannot negotiate in good faith when we are receiving 10% of new money compared to what was passed in the House in the HEROES bill. Unlike the CARES Act, which we passed unanimously in March, the proposal now being negotiated only provides a $300 supplement for unemployed workers rather than $600 a week. Further, unlike the $1,200 direct payment for every working class individual and $500 for each child, this agreement being negotiated provides absolutely nothing, zero. Moreover, this proposal does nothing to address the health care crisis impacting tens of millions of Americans who cannot afford medical care and has totally inadequate financial assistance for the most vulnerable. The American people need help, and they need help now. In fact, there has never been a time in the modern history of this country when the American people were in more economic desperation and a time when people needed help. And if a government means anything, It means that we cannot turn our backs on tens of millions of families who today are suffering. So, Madam President, we have got to make sure that every working family in America, every working individual in America, receives at least $1,200 in direct payment. That is what we have got to do. We cannot continue the status quo of simply coming in here to work and then going home and going back on for our holiday. So, Madam President, I am going to do everything that I can to insist that we make sure that every working person in this country gets a $1,200 direct payment. And we're not going to go home until that happens. Madam President, thank you very much.
Their interests, their needs should be first on our to-do list, not last. Now, I've heard some of my colleagues say that there just isn't enough left for working families, that once we take care of our other priorities and COVID relief, there just isn't enough left to give direct assistance to individuals. I want to respectfully suggest that those priorities are exactly reversed. We should begin with the working people of this country. And that's why the legislation that Senator Sanders and I are introducing, which I believe every senator voted for in March. It's simple legislation, $1,200 for each individual, $2,400 for a couple, and $500 for every dependent in the family. It's exactly what this Congress approved overwhelmingly back in March. And it was indeed a lifeline. I know it was for Missourians in my state, for working families in my state. I remember in the hours and days after Congress passed this in.
Let me just say this. In March, as Senator HAWLEY indicated, we came together, and I had the same experience in Vermont.